Welcome everyone to Fruits of the Orchard. Tonight we're going to be learning Parshat Pinchas. Just as a review, the end of last Parsha, after Bilam could not succeed in cursing the Jews, he came up with, in his mind, even a better idea, is get Israel to sin and they'll bring down a curse upon themselves. And so through his advice, the Moabites and the Midianites sent their daughters to entice the men in idol worship and different sexual practices, and unfortunately succeeded. And a plague breaks out in the camp, and no one knows what to do, including Moshe. And Pinchas comes and reminds Moshe what the halacha is in this case. And since it was a mass desecration of God's name, of the Torah, and 24,000 people had died in the plague, so Pinchas kills the prince of Shimon, Zimri, who had taken one of the daughters of the king, Cosby Batsur, and publicly had relations with her. It was just a terrible, terrible scene. And by his killing them, which is really like a baked din, a judgment, the plague stopped. And in this week's Parsha, he is awarded a covenant of peace. For those who are following Living with the Times, this is the subject of today's episode about this covenant of peace. So what I want to start with from Fruits of the Orchard is the fact that in the name Pinchas, in this parsha, his name is written, the yud in his name is written small. And we know that any time we have a big letter or a small letter, it's indicating that there is a deeper understanding that needs to be explored. So the question is, why is the yud small in Pinchas's name? Here he did something like very bold, very zealot. He wasn't a zealot, but in this particular case, he acted with zealousness. So one might expect that the yud would be big, but it's small. And this is to indicate a very simple message here, is despite the fact that he acted with tremendous courage, tremendous bravery, tremendous strength, on the inside, he was humble. He was the little yud himself. And so we're going to use this just to explore the phenomenon of Jewish leadership throughout the Tanakh until our day, that the real leaders of Israel almost always try to avoid being in the position of leadership. And when they took it upon themselves, it was only when they believed that it was truly the will of God and no one else could do it. So here we see Pinchas, even Moshe didn't know what to do in this situation. But Pinchas very respectfully and with what's called derech eretz approached Moshe and almost very nicely reminded him of what the halacha was here. And despite the fact that he acted with such strength, on the inside, he didn't lose his humbleness. Now, this goes for Moshe all the time. Moshe is one of the greatest leaders in Jewish history, maybe in world history. And yet, the Torah testifies that he was the most humble person on the face of the earth. So we might think that that's a contradiction. How can it be that someone who is so humble could be such a great leader. But that is the teaching that the Torah wants to impart, that they're not contradictory, that being humble on the inside does not mean that one is ineffective with dealing with the world or can't exert leadership qualities. And in fact, in our, call it philosophy, that is what gives strength to a leader. The leader is not there to build up his ego, build up his bank account, build up his power base. A Jewish leader is there to lead according to the will of God. So 2 times in the Torah, when the people are complaining against Moshe and Aaron and God, so Moshe says, "V'nachnu ma." What are we that you are complaining against? You're not complaining against us, you're complaining against God. We are just God's messenger, his vessel to manifest his will in the world. So this phrase, "V'nachnu ma," what are we? But that sounds like a question. If you read it as a statement, is we are really nothing. And one other time when the people, when Korach is complaining about Aaron, Moshe says, "Mahu," like you don't understand who Aaron is. You don't understand how much humbleness he has. Now, if you look at the name Moshe, so you see something very interesting. The name Moshe is 3 Hebrew letters, Mem, Shin, He. The first and the last letters, Mem, He, spell Ma. V'nachnu ma. But the Shin in the middle is the letter of Esh, of fire. So this perfectly represents Moshe, especially because when God first reveals himself to Moshe, it's at the burning bush. It's fire. And Moshe, to accomplish what he had to, he had to express this fire of the soul to overcome such enormous obstacles to bring Israel out of Egypt and to lead them for 40 years in the desert. So the name Moshe really represents who Moshe was. V'nachnu ma. Aaron also, that because he wanted to try to stall the people, excuse me, he was trying to stall the people until Moshe came back. He was confident Moshe would come back, but the people were very impatient. And it turns out that he actually was a vehicle for making the golden calf, despite his wanting just the opposite. And this weighed heavy on his conscience the whole rest of his life. And when the Mishkan was dedicated, the tabernacle was dedicated, he felt, how can I be the high priest after being complicit in making the golden calf? He felt completely unworthy of being the high priest. And Moshe says to him, because you feel unworthy, that's why God chose you. In other words, your true existential lowliness and humbleness is exactly what God wants. And we see this with many of the great leaders, how they try to avoid being the leader. We don't have time to go into all of the stories, but King Saul, the first king of Israel, was couldn't believe that God had chosen him to be king. And at first he refused. The prophet Samuel, Shmuel Navi, came to him and said, God has chosen you as king. And it was like, what are you talking about? I'm not worthy. I'm not up to it. And David was, the kingship was taken away from Shaul, and David was anointed in private. It was a secret. And Shaul, in tremendous jealousy, tried to kill David on many occasions. And David had the chance to kill Shaul, and he wouldn't. He refused. It was basically, he was saying, God, if you want me to be king, you'll have to arrange it. I will not lift a finger against Shaul. And when David danced the Aron and the Mishkan up to Jerusalem, so he was dancing like crazy. He was like besides himself in joy. And his wife, Michal, who was the daughter of Shaul, looks out the window and feels that David's making a fool out of himself. He's not acting like a king. And when David comes home, she berates him that you acted unkingly. And David says to her, "V'hayiti shafel be'enai," that you were only looking on the outside. Inside, v'hayiti shafel be'enai, I was very, very lowly in my own eyes. So this is just another example. It just happens that I'm reading now the biography of the Rebbe Rashab. He was the fourth in the line of Chabad Rebbes. And when his father passed away, it was clear to everyone that he was the appointed one to be the next Rebbe. It took him 10 years before he completely took upon himself the responsibility and the position of the Rebbe of Chabad. He did it very slowly, but in the inside, he didn't just like grab it. It took 10 years for him to completely accept and take upon himself. It was really a yoke. Leadership is such a huge responsibility. And we know that the Lubavitcher Rebbe, he waited a whole year after the Friedeker Rebbe passed away before he accepted upon himself the yoke of leadership. I just want to mention two other examples in a different manner, three actually. One, it's a famous story of the Chafetz Chaim. Chafetz Chaim in his life was one of the most famous, respected rabbis in the world. And one time someone came to visit him, and he came to his you call it his apartment, his house. He couldn't believe how small it was, and it was virtually without furniture. And the man was quite wealthy himself, and in total amazement, he said, "Rebbe, where is the furniture in the house?" And the Rebbe said to him, "Where is your furniture?" So the man didn't quite understand, but he answered. He said, "Well, I'm not at home. I'm visiting, so I can't take my furniture with me." So the Chafetz Chaim said, "I'm also on a journey in this world, and at one point I will leave this world, so I can't take my furniture with me." But it's true also of Rav Kanievsky, who just passed away. There were different records of how many people. It was, I'm not sure, maybe 6 months ago, 9 months ago, I can't remember exactly. It's very recent. There was something like 400,000 people came to his funeral. It was just massive. And he accepted people all over the world, and everyone had the same reaction. It was this tiny little place in Bnei Brak, and like people couldn't, this is like the most celebrated rabbi in the world. And he's living in this tiny little apartment. And they say the same thing about Rabbi Moshe Feinstein in New York. Also, in each one of these rebbes, probably millions, tens of millions of dollars went to their hands that they distributed to charity. But they themselves lived totally a sparse kind of lifestyle. So that is the idea of the first article in Fruits of the Orchard today. And this is all indicated by the little yud in Pinchas's name. Now, the next article is very, very interesting. It's called The Initiatives of Moshe. And this is based on a Rashi in this week's Parsha. In this week's Parsha, Moshe already knows that he is not going to lead Israel into the Holy Land. And in this Parsha, he approaches God, he prays to God to appoint a leader. In other words, who should take over for me? He didn't entertain the idea that he would choose. This is another indication, is it wasn't like he just went ahead and he appointed who would take over for him. He waited for God. And here he approaches God and says, who will take over? And so God reveals it would be Yehoshua. And so in the Parsha, this is the source of what's called smicha, that even today, rabbinic ordination is called smicha. And smicha literally means resting one's hands. The first time it appears is with sacrifices, with offerings. And when someone would bring an offering in the temple, they would do what's called smicha, where they would, in a sense, transfer their being. If it was a sin offering, it was as if they were transferring the sin to the animal, and the animal would be offered up instead of them. Or if it was a Thanksgiving offering, where the animal became the symbol of a person's inner soul, inner thoughts, inner tshuva. And so in this week's Parsha, God tells Moshe to put his hand on Yehoshua's head and transfer the leadership through this symbolic act. But when it happens, it says that Moshe put his hands in the plural. So we might miss that subtlety, but Rashi didn't. And Rashi points out that God said, put your hand, but Moshe put both of his hands. And Rashi says this indicates that many times when leadership is passed on, sometimes it's done with great reluctance, with great jealousy, with lots of distaste, that the leader has to now transfer power to someone else. But Rashi points out that the fact that Moshe put both of his hands on Yeshua is showing how much he wasn't jealous, wasn't upset, and he wanted so much for Yeshua to be successful, to fulfill his mission. So from that, it's clear that Rashi is saying that Moshe took his own initiative to put both of his hands. So that got me thinking, when else did Moshe show initiative? So that's what we're going to do now. And we're going to see it's a bit paradoxical, because in Parshat Bahalotcha, the parsha where Miriam and Aaron are somewhat complaining about Moshe, and God comes to them and kind of says, I'm going to tell you who Moshe is. Let's get this straight here. And that's where God reveals that Moshe is unique, not just in that generation. Of all the prophets, until Mashiach comes, there is no one like Moshe. And God says, I speak to him peh el peh, mouth to mouth. In a different place in the Torah, God says, I speak to Moshe panim el panim, face to face. And in that exchange, so God calls Moshe his faithful servant. It's his Eved Ne'aman. He says, God says, there's no one as faithful in all of my house as Moshe. So we might think this is a contradiction, like in the beginning of the class. It may sound it's a contradiction to be both humble and a strong leader at the same time. Here, it may sound like a contradiction to be called a servant of God, and yet we see Moshe over and over takes initiative on his own, which is somewhat surprising. So what we're going to do now, we're going to rather quickly just go through a series of times where Moshe acts on his own. He shows tremendous initiative. And this begins right from the beginning, where we learned that Moshe goes out to see about his brethren. Moshe is the prince of Egypt. His brethren are the slaves. At some point, his Jewish consciousness, his Jewish identity is starting to overcome his Egyptian identity. And he sees a taskmaster beating a Jew. And to save the Jew, he kills the Mitzri. Because of that, now he's Prince of Egypt. He could have called one of the other taskmasters and said, break up this fight. But he himself took the initiative, and he killed the Mitzri. There's a great secret here, is that the term for the Egyptian, ha-Mitzri, is the same gematria as Moshe. And here we see a very deep thing here, is Moshe was going through an identity crisis here. Am I an Egyptian? Am I the prince of Egypt? Am I from the house of Pharaoh? Or am I a Jew? And the other Jews are all slaves. Like, who am I? And so by his on a more, call it allegorical level, Moshe, by killing the Mitzri, is in a sense deciding that his Jewish identity has to move to the forefront. And in a sense, he needs to kill his Egyptian identity. And then we see when he has to flee Egypt, and he comes to the well, and the daughters of Yitro are being bullied around by the other shepherds, and Moshe saves them. Again, he takes tremendous initiative, and he saves them. Then we get to the burning bush. Now, later, God calls Moshe his most faithful servant. But at the burning bush, Moshe argues with him for an entire week. Like, choose someone else. I'm not able, I'm not worthy, I'm not capable. There are people better than me. My brother for sure is better than me. So again, you would think, like, how is being a faithful servant arguing with God for an entire week? In the end, Moshe accepts the mantle of leadership, and he goes back to Egypt. He goes to Pharaoh the first time, let my people go. And Pharaoh basically laughs in his face, and he doubles the work. So when Moshe comes out, he turns to God and he says, Lama hirata amazah, v'lama shalachtani. Why have you done evil to this people, and why did you send me? Here again, this is Moshe, in a sense, accusing God of being not compassionate. God says, now I will show you what I will do to Pharaoh and how I will bring Israel out with an outstretched arm. But here, Moshe feels that God is not being compassionate, not being just, and he challenges God. We see it later after the golden calf, that God says, move out of my way and I'll make a new people from you. What an offer. Moshe, you'll be the new Avram Avinu. I'll start the whole people from you. How did Moshe react? He said, if you do such a thing, God, wipe me out of the book that you have written. I'll have nothing to do with this. Again, we see Moshe taking such a strong stand. Then with the spies, there's a huge debate, but at least the way Rashi is learning it, when the parsha is called Shlach Lecha. And even though when you read this, what seems like the simple literal understanding of the text, it sounds like God is commanding Moshe to send the spies. But there's a subtlety here, because it says Shlach Lecha, you should send. So Rashi quotes the tradition that God said, I'm not telling you to send, and I'm not telling you not to send. If you want to send, send. In other words, it's your decision. We discussed this a couple of weeks ago. It's an incredibly deep and complex question as to who decided to send the spies and why. It has many layers to it. My purpose right now is not to go back into that. But here again, it appears that God is saying to Moshe, it's up to you. If you want to send them, send them. Then we have the hitting of the rock, where God tells Moshe to speak to the rock, and instead he hits the rock. Again, this is very complex, and we're not going to go revisit this. But again, the idea of all these examples is, Moshe says, V'nachnu ma, what are we that you're complaining? We're just doing God's will. But we see over and over again, Moshe takes initiative. And so now I'm going to bring three things. It's in the Talmud. If anyone wants to look this up, it's mentioned in two different places in the Talmud. One is in the Tractate of Shabbat, page 87a. And the other one is in Yevamot, page 62a. It's the same tradition. There's different opinions going on, but the basic idea is that Moshe took initiative in 3 different areas, and God came and agreed with them. What are the 3? Breaking the tablets. If you look at the text very carefully, when after 40 days, God says to Moshe, go down from the mountain. Your people are worshiping a golden calf. Moshe comes down. He sees them dancing around the golden calf, and he breaks the luchot. You don't see anywhere that God told him to break the luchot. This was like a radical action on Moshe's part. These luchot were written with the etzba Elokim, the finger of God. We're told that they were a cube of sapphire, and they were at such a high level, we have no concept. And he broke them. So this is the first thing where it says that Moshe took the initiative and God later agreed with him. How do we know that? Because later in the Torah, God is reminding Moshe about the whole incident of the golden calf and how he had broken the tablets. And he says, the tablets asher shibarta, the tablets that you broke. So the sages say, don't read it asher shibarta, read it yeshar kochacha asher shibarta. Good go, yeshar koyach, Moshe, you broke the tablets. So here we see that God agreed. Moshe took the initiative. He didn't ask God what to do, but he broke the tablets. That's the first thing. The second thing is a bit surprising, that Moshe took the initiative to separate from his wife. Now, this is something we discussed a few weeks ago. And the verse that's brought, if you didn't know this Gemara, you would think, and almost rightfully so, that God commanded him to separate from his wife. How do we know this? Because after the whole incident with the golden calf, and the people began the process of doing tshuva, so God said, you can tell the people they can go back to their tents, but you stand here with me. And over there, Rashi says, what does it mean? What does it mean, go back to your tents? So Rashi says it means that husband and wives could go back to their tents and go back to having intimate relations. But Moshe, you stand here with me. So it sounds like God said to him, you should separate from your wife. And that was the whole thing that Miriam and Aaron were complaining about. They didn't think it was right for Moshe to separate from his wife. It wasn't a good example for the people. But the Gemara says, actually, it was Moshe's initiative because he felt that's what God wanted him to do. And God approved of it when he said, and you stand here with me. In other words, Moshe, your decision to separate from your wife, I agree to. And Moshe's reasoning, as discussed in the Gemara, is that before we received the Torah, everyone had to prepare for 3 days. And part of that was to not engage in marital relations. So Moshe figured if a one-time appearance of God to the people justified everyone separating from marital relations, how much more so should I, who God appears to me all the time? How much more should I? And God came to agree with it. Now, Moshe is the exception. We know that being celibate is not a Jewish thing. It's totally not a Jewish thing. But in this particular case, God came to agree with Moshe. And the third thing that Moshe took initiative, we didn't mention it yet, is that God came to Moshe and said, tell the people to prepare for 3 days. And on the third day, I will come and I will reveal the 10 commandments. It was in the middle of the day when Moshe got this command. And so in his own initiative, he didn't want to count that day as one of the days. So he added a day. And it's a huge discussion in the Gemara if he added a day or he didn't add a day. And if he did add a day, why? And if he did, how do we know that? It's a whole long discussion. I already told you where you could find it. Shabbat 87a or Yevamot 62a. Rashi seems to agree with Rabbi Yossi, who says that Moshe added another day. Today, we celebrate Shavuos on the 6th of Sivan. But according to Rabbi Yossi, the day that the 10 commandments were revealed was on the 7th of Sivan. So these are the 3 things that Moshe took initiative and God came to agree with. That God came to agree with. Now there's one that we didn't mention, and that is Moshe's decision to take the Erev Rav, the mixed multitude, out of Egypt when Israel was redeemed. And in fact, the Midrash tells us that God came to Moshe and says, don't take them. I know why you want to. Your heart is full of compassion. These are the people that Yosef had given circumcision to in the hope of extricating all of Egypt from the depths of impurity. And Yosef wanted to fix the whole world. And as de facto leader of Egypt, he wanted to use that power to try to rectify Egypt and rectify the world. And so the progeny of these people who were given circumcision became known as the mixed multitude. In other words, they were very sympathetic to the Jewish people. They felt somewhat a part of the Jewish people. They had empathy. So when it came time to leave Egypt, they requested to come with Israel, and Moshe didn't want to turn them down. But God said, they're not ready. They're not ready. Don't take them. And Moshe, on his own initiative, took them, and they became a source of many, many, many problems in the desert, the mixed multitude. So here, this is what we'll call an overview. We see that, especially hitting the rock, God obviously didn't agree with that, because the result of that, the effect was that Moshe couldn't come into Israel. So it wasn't like God agreed with every one of Moshe's initiatives. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. But the picture we're painting here is here you have someone who's described as the most humble person on the face of the earth, who God calls my faithful servant, and yet Moshe is taking initiative. Moshe is even arguing with God. And in the case of the Erev Rav, is outright not listening to God. So it's a bit paradoxical. But we could go back to Avraham. Avraham paved the way for all future leaders. And the whole incident where Avram is negotiating with God over saving the evil people of Sodom becomes a paradigm, an archetypal model of someone with tremendous faith in God. And he says to God, he says, is the God of justice not to act justly? How can you punish the righteous with the unrighteous? So this, on the surface, is a pretty chutzpah thing to say to God. And yet, God didn't react that way. In fact, God chose Abraham, in a sense, because that when Avram felt that he had to speak out, he had the right to, and even the obligation to speak out. Now, it doesn't mean that God, in the end, Avram didn't really get what he was asking for. But that's not the point. The point is that he felt he had the right to petition God in that way. As he was doing it, he paved the way for Moshe. And he said that he was afar ve'efer. I'm dust and ashes. In other words, who am I to challenge the creator of the world? Nonetheless, you made me a father of many nations. You made me responsible for the whole world. My mission is to rectify the whole world. So how can I not speak out when I see injustice? And we see that that's exactly what God wants from us. So here we see that being a faithful servant doesn't mean that God wants everyone to be yes people. God wants us, he wants us to have the freedom to speak our mind and our heart. And we see many of the prophets did the same thing. Many of the prophets were faithful to the mission that God had given them. But we see that many times, and it's recorded in the books of the prophets, sometimes they somewhere between challenge God and just question God, like, what is happening here? Why is this happening? And until our day, especially when bad things happen to righteous people, how can we not cry out like that? I'll never forget, and I'll share with you that one of the young members of the Moshav, Eish Kodesh Gilmore, was killed in a terrorist attack at the very beginning of the Second Intifada. And it was a very traumatic event in the life of the Moshav. And I remember at the Levaya, at the funeral, so the chief rabbi of Israel now, Rabbi Lau, at that time was the chief rabbi of the city of Modi'in, which is, of course, right next to our yeshuv. So he knew us and we knew him. So he came to Levaya. And again, this was right in the beginning of the Second Intifada, and it was just terribly shocking, the whole what was going on. And I'll never forget him like lifting his hand in his eyes and saying, Rabbona Shalom, what do you want from us? What do you want from us? It was just such a powerful moment. The Lubavitcher Rebbe, I mentioned this before, was known in a Farbrengen with like thousands of people there to openly cry and say, Rabbona Shalom, ad matai? Until when is all of this suffering going to continue? Ad matai? Now, would anyone think that the Lubavitcher Rebbe had not anything less than complete faith in God? But that faith in God includes the reshut, the permission to cry out from the heart to God. That's what prayer is about. So here we see Moshe is a very complex person. He's not a one-dimensional person. And so hopefully tonight we try to delve into the contradictions or the paradoxes between being humble and being a leader, being a faithful servant and being able to speak one's mind to God. And so I bless us all that we have the kind of faith that Avram had and that Moshe had. And at the same time, when we have that cry in the heart, that we know that God wants us to express it. Doesn't mean we'll always get our way, doesn't mean we'll always understand, but God wants us to open our heart and express ourselves. Bracha. Wait, hold on.